Welcome back to that God Power channel. This is the channel where we're going to unlock the God Power that's laying dormant on the inside of you. But first today, what we're going to do is we're going to continue breaking down the book of Acts. We're speeding through this one, not necessarily speeding through it, but we're getting through this. We're on chapter 14 today. So if you haven't seen chapter 13 or any of the other chapters, obviously I suggest that you go back and watch those chapters so that you can get caught up on the story, because this is a really dope story. It's a lot of things going on here. It's like a whole bunch of different stories compiled into one, but they're all about the acts of the apostles after Jesus died and how they spread Christianity. So if you remember on last episode, it was chapter 13, and at the end of chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas, they were preaching in a town, and then they got kicked out. Like the mob was incited against them, and then they got ran out of town. And so they went to this town called Iconium, and that's where chapter 14 begins. So starting with chapter 14, the same thing happened in Iconium. Paul and Barnabas went to the Jewish synagogue, and they preached with such power that a great number of both Jews and Greeks became believers. Some Jews, however, rejected God's message and poisoned the minds of the Gentiles against Paul and Barnabas. But the apostles, they stayed there for a long time, preaching boldly about the grace of the Lord. And the Lord proved their message was true by giving them power to do miraculous signs and wonders. But the people of the town, they were divided in their opinion about Paul and Barnabas. Some sided with the Jews and some sided with the apostles. And so a mob of Gentiles and Jews, along with their leaders, decided to attack and stone them. Now, when the apostles learned of this, they fled to a region of Lycaonia, to the towns of Lystra and Derbe and the surrounding areas, where they preached the good news. Now, while they were at Lystra, Paul and Barnabas came upon a man with crippled feet. He'd been that way since birth, and he'd never been able to walk. So he was sitting and listening to Paul preach. And then Paul looked straight at him, and he realized that he had the faith to be healed. So Paul called to him in a loud voice, and he said, "Stand up." And the man jumped to his feet and started walking. Now when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in their local dialect. They were like, "These men are gods in human form." And they decided Barnabas was the Greek god Zeus, and Paul was Hermes, since he was the chief speaker. Now the temple of Zeus was located just outside the town. So the priest of the temple and the crowd brought bulls and wreaths of flowers to the town gates and prepared to offer sacrifices to the apostles. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard about what was happening, they tore their clothes in dismay, and they ran out among the people shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We are merely human beings just like you. We've come to bring you the good news that you should turn from these worthless things and turn to the living God who made heaven and earth, the sea, and everything in them. In the past, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, but he never left them without evidence of himself and his goodness. For instance, he sends you rain and good crops and gives you food and joyful hearts." But even with all these good words, Paul and Barnabas could scarcely restrain the people from sacrificing to them. So then some Jews arrived from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowds over to their side. And they stoned Paul and dragged him out the town thinking he was dead. Like, hold on. Can you believe that they just stoned Paul after they was about to sacrifice to him? They just stoned him and almost killed him. Basically, they thought he was dead, so he was like laying lifeless. And they dragged him out the town. But as the believers gathered around him, he got up and went back into the town. The next day, he left with Barnabas for the town called Derbe. Now, after preaching the good news in Derbe and making many disciples, Paul and Barnabas returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia, where they had strengthened the believers. They encouraged them to continue in faith, reminding them that we must suffer many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. Paul and Barnabas also appointed elders in every church. With prayer and fasting, they turned the elders over to the care of the Lord in whom they had put their trust. So basically, they're like, okay, you guys are the elders, but you know what I'm saying, we've given you all we can, so now I give this to God. God's going to handle it and make sure y'all do the right thing. So then they traveled back through Pisidia to Pamphylia, and they preached the word in Persia, then went down to Attalia. Finally, they returned by ship to Antioch of Syria, where the journey had begun. The believers there had entrusted them to the grace of God to do the work that they had now completed. Now, upon arriving in Antioch, they called the church together and reported everything God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles too. And they stayed there with the believers for a long time. And that's literally the end of chapter 14. It's a very short chapter, but it's kind of I think it's very impactful. Really what happened is that you see that Paul and Barnabas are going on this mission. They're going through all these towns where there's not a lot of believers, and they're converting a lot of people to be believers by preaching the good news. And that definitely comes with a price, as you see, because Paul got beat up. He got stoned to the point where everybody thought he was dead. However, God revived him, and he got up and he just kept on about his way, still preaching boldly. And this message speaks to me because a lot of times things will come against you to try to make you stop doing what you know is right. But you just got to keep on going, no matter how hard it may get. Like, literally think about Paul. He got stoned to the point where they thought he was dead. That probably hurt a lot. And that will probably make most of us want to stop and chill and be like, nah, this is probably not for me. But Paul and Barnabas, they just kept on going. They was just like, we got to get this message out. So they kept on going. And then they came back and they shared the message just to solidify to the believers that were already believers, look at what God has done through us. And then they shared that, God's even opened up the door for the Gentiles to become believers now. So this gift is for everybody. And that's the end. So hopefully you learned something from chapter 14. Hopefully you got a lot out of it because it's a little chapter. But if you did get something out of it, share it with somebody. Tell somebody, the good news. Like, to be like Paul and Barnabas. Do the right thing no matter the cost. Because it might hurt sometimes. And it might physically hurt sometimes. But just keep on going. Also, remember that you can pass along your good vibes to anybody that you come in contact with. Maybe just flash them a smile. Say hey. There's not a lot of people that say hey, especially in the city that I'm in. I'm used to Southern hospitality, but out here in LA, it's not about Southern hospitality. People just walk by each other not saying anything. Flash people a smile and say hey, hello, good morning, good evening. Most of the time they're really friendly and they'll smile back and they'll be so surprised that somebody actually talked to them. Pass your good vibes along. But most importantly, just remember that you got that God power.
Loving the God power. I got the God power.
Tapping the sources, caught in the vibes. I just thank God I'm alive. I just thank God that I'm fly.